Hello, and welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm Michelle Tuck Ponder. Today's episode is brought to you by Destination Imagination, commonly referred to as DI, the leading creative problem-solving experience for children. Through DI's innovative, project-based educational experiences, participants gain the skills that will set them up for success in careers like the one we're going to hear about today. Learn more about DI at destinationimagination.org. On today's episode, we are pleased to welcome Andrew Berry. Andrew is the Cleveland Browns Executive Vice President of Football Operations and General Manager. He's also served as the Vice President of Football Operations with the Philadelphia Eagles and also spent 7 seasons in the front office of the Indianapolis Colts. Berry graduated cum laude from Harvard University with a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in computer science. While at Harvard, he was a 4-year starter as a cornerback and was a 3-time All-Ivy League team selection. Berry and his wife, Britton, have 2 boys, Zion and Cairo, and a new daughter, Eden. Before I say anything, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
That's wonderful. And welcome from Berea, Ohio. We're really delighted to have you here, especially since you are an alumnus of our Destination Imagination program. So
I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me, Michelle.
Thanks for joining us. So, I always start because especially we bring people on this program to talk about careers and how they got there. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your current job?
Sure. I guess really probably anyone who gets into the NFL, you could hear 10, ask that question to 10 different people and probably hear 9 different stories. And I'm probably no exception. So I grew up in a football household. My dad and his side of the family, they were huge Cowboys fans. My mother, they were huge Falcons fans, being from Georgia. And so coming up, I had a twin brother, an older sister. It was basically like, faith family football pretty early on. And we were, at least my brother and I, we were probably Cowboys fans from like the age of like 3 or 4. By the time we could talk. And so football was always like a major interest. I played starting in middle school, high school, played in college at Harvard, and probably like a lot of college athletes, I was hopeful one day to actually play in the NFL. I was fortunate enough to be at least a good enough player to get into rookie minicamp with Washington. But I really didn't stick long. I was kind of like a fringe prospect. So at that point, I had already accepted a job to work in financial services, work on Wall Street coming out of college. But I wasn't truly excited about going that route. I had gotten a lot of really great experience, but I was really more trying to talk myself into the fact that it was a good resume builder, it was a good company, good money, but I wasn't excited. And so I really kind of lucked into this career path because my first boss in the NFL was a man named Tom Telesco. He was a scouting director for the Indianapolis Colts at the time. He's now actually the current general manager for the Los Angeles Chargers. He had scouted me at Harvard, as a prospect, and had gotten familiar with my background. He reached out and he said, "Hey, just given your background, I think you'd have be a really great fit, working in an NFL front office and particularly player personnel if you have any interest in it. And we have this entry-level position, this entry-level scouting assistant position. Would you like to come interview for it?" And I didn't know much about scouting or NFL front offices or anything along those lines. I knew I was interested in football on some level. And so I really, to be honest, took the interview more as a courtesy at first. But then after preparing for the interview, meeting people in Indianapolis, learning more from Tom, it was one of those things where it was like, hey, I really think that this is me because it's at the intersection of a lot of different things that I'm interested in. And so I was fortunate enough to receive the job offer. And so I really just did a 180 and packed up my stuff and my 93 Acura Legend and drove out to Indianapolis and didn't look back.
So that's a big decision. Wall Street football and Wall Street, you pretty much, you do a good job and work 23 hours a day, you know what's going to happen.
That's right.
You know where that story ends. But football you were really starting at the ground level. So what was it? Like, I know, it was the intersection of things, but what was it that you said, I'm going to take this risk?
I think it was my own personal passion, because when I thought about the job and the career trajectory, I got excited. Like it, all jobs are work, but all jobs don't necessarily always have to feel like work. And that was the sense that I got for this career path, because I love the sport. I was using my mind and creativity, whether it was with player evaluation, contract management, research and strategy, general operations, and every day was different. It's obviously super competitive, and you're working at the highest level of the sport. And I should also say this. I think of the people that I was able to enter the NFL with. Like, I worked under a Hall of Fame general manager. I mentioned, my first direct boss. He's now a current general manager in the sport. And we had a number of really good people that are either general managers for other clubs today or high level executives. So I came under a really good group and a really established staff that invested in me personally. So it was really that, passion in conjunction with, feeling I was learning and growing and able to exercise my interest in a number of different domains. And then also just exercise like critical thinking skills and creativity.
So, one of the things I think that people are interested in about football, and I come from a mixed family. We were a Jets-Giants family. So, so there was a lot of fuss and fighting and arguing. But a lot of times people don't realize that football is a business. Yeah. And so as you look at it from that business perspective, can you talk a little bit about what you learned in DI around communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity? How do you use those skills in your work today?
Yeah, so I'll actually talk about communication and collaboration on the first. We say football is the consummate team sport, because it really does take 11 individuals on a given play to have success. But that really extends past the playing field to your global football operation. I mean, to put together a team or get it to Sunday, it takes not just, your coaches and players, but your personnel group, which is your college scouts, your pro scouts, your contract management team, your research and strategy group that handles all the data analysis, your general support staff group. So that's like performance, medical, video, equipment. And as a general manager, when you're overseeing the entire operation and you're trying to get everybody to like row in the same direction with a roster of 53 individuals, as opposed to maybe, 5 or 6 or 20 to 25, it takes a lot of deliberate practice to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody's in the know and in the loop, so you can execute the daily responsibilities of running a club. And that really speaks to the collaboration. If we are making a roster decision or a hiring decision or, managing a situation in the game, it doesn't really just fall on one person. So, I like to give the example of, we just had, the NFL draft. And during our last round of draft meetings, we had our pro scouts, our college scouts, our coaches, our research team, our football information systems team, because they all have a significant hand in composing our final draft board, because every individual has a different perspective and perhaps a different input that ultimately leads to where a player is placed and then ultimately selected. I think oftentimes people look at it from maybe the external side of things and think it's like, okay, it's just the general manager saying, hey, I like this guy and like, let's do it. And I don't doubt that that's the case in some areas, but that's not how we operate, because we want to make sure that we bring the best ideas and best perspectives to the table. So we minimize the number of blind spots in decision making. And that probably leads to like the critical thinking and creativity aspect. Football is a little bit more of or has been more of a traditional business relative to some of the other sports in terms of the day-to-day operations or decision-making practices. We are very deliberate in attempting to make sure that we challenge the status quo and are, hopefully on the cutting edge of best practices. We borrow from other businesses, we borrow from other sports, and ultimately we really push our group to say, hey, if we didn't have any institutional knowledge in terms of how something was done, we just did this, had a blank canvas, or we're doing this from scratch, is this the way we would actually do it? Does this actually give us the best results? And I think that has served us real well as we've evolved over time as a football operation.
So how did you manage the pivot, or I don't even know what to describe COVID as? Because, if you look at the NBA and they did the bubble thing, and you look at all the major sports, football was sort of unique in that it was almost impossible to do it that way. What was your thought process when you realized that last season was not going to be?
Yeah, it was a major challenge, but I guess from our perspective, it was like, all right, what can we control? What can't we control? We can't control the effects of a pandemic or how long it's going to last. But we can control how we operate within those constraints. And probably speaking to the creativity component, sometimes necessity breeds innovation. We had to, I think back to, the pandemic hit my second month on the job. And so call it 80% of the way through our roster building processes, there were two things dumped in our lap. Brand new CBA a week before the new league year started. And then the pandemic was maybe 2 weeks after that. So we really had to totally revamp how we were going to do really the last 60 days before we were making major decisions in free agency and major decisions in the draft. And a big part of that was figuring out, okay, here are things that we typically do and we typically do in person. One, do we actually need them? If we do, and honestly, for a lot of things, we kind of we probably don't need them. And two, for the things that we did need is there an alternative way to acquire that piece of information or that exposure? And there was and certainly what we're doing today, right? A Zoom, interview where you're in Kansas City and I'm in, Berea, Ohio, and we're able to talk face to face. That was a huge tool for us, not only throughout the draft process, but and this is probably a credit to our head coach, but building a community over Zoom with a new locker room, a new coaching staff, and then ultimately going to the season to figure out how do we teach our players and our staff, our systems, knowing that we can't necessarily be in person. So it was maybe the short way of saying it is it was a challenge, and it was a little bit of a week to week, month to month, figuring out the best solution given the constraints upon us. But honestly, it's an experience that I would not trade for the world, because there are still several practices that we'll keep in place, even as the pandemic eases.
I think your comments are really going to resonate with DI kids, because you're talking about a challenge and you're talking about barriers and you're talking about eliminating possibilities and finding a solution. So, that's going to resonate with our kids and with our audience. And we need to take a break right now, though. So we'll be right back with Andrew Berry, who is the general manager of the Cleveland Browns.
Destination Imagination is busy behind the scenes, planning an exciting new season of creativity, collaboration, STEAM learning, and a lot of fun for your kids. Your favorite young people can choose from one of 7 brand new in-person challenges now when you start a team. If you're ready to awaken creativity and ignite a love of learning in your child, join us today. To get started, visit us at destinationimagination.org/the big idea.
Welcome back to What's the Big Idea? I'm Michelle Tuck-Ponder here with our guest, Andrew Berry. And, one of the things that we were just talking about having to shift and pivot and readjust after COVID, it resonates with what our DI kids do. But one of the other things our DI kids love, and many of them have an interest in professional sports beyond I'm a fan, but they don't know. You mentioned a lot of things within operations that don't take place on the field. So if you were going to pick 1 or 2 positions or things that happen in your scope of work or what you oversee, what do you think people should know about it? What do you wish kids knew who say, I want to be in sports? What kind of jobs are available or opportunities are available?
That's a fantastic question. So I think the first is, and you hit on this a little bit in your question, the breadth of roles, experiences, like expertise that not just NFL teams, but MLB teams, NBA teams, really any major sports league will hire. I think you're right that people think, okay, if I can't play, then really maybe the only thing I can do is like coach, or, maybe someone will say, maybe I can just coach and scout. But the reality of it is these are billion-dollar organizations that are making, multi-million-dollar decisions. And no different than the skill sets that, Google or, financial services, or like really no different than any Fortune 500 company with search in terms of like hiring talent. It is actually pretty similar in a lot of sports organizations. So the example that I give is when I was in college, if you would have asked me, hey, how relevant would my computer science, master's degree be in a football organization, I would have assumed that it wouldn't be that relevant. But the reality of it is the usage of big data, and it probably realistically started with baseball probably 2 decades ago, but in the need for data scientists, chief strategists, things along those nature that can work with, that have that technical expertise. There's a really high demand for those individuals, in the NFL and across sports, but that's not something that people typically think about. Or, with our contract management team that manages the salary cap, can't have enough people who are, not only good with numbers, but, really quite honestly, people come from distinguished law programs, because that skill set's important. And so those are maybe two examples that don't necessarily come top of mind when people think of sports. But those are also 2 examples of some of the more critical roles in the global operation. So maybe the long way of saying is any skill set that would be transferable in like really most organizations and most industries you work on, there's probably a place for it and a prominent role for it in a sports organization as well.
But there's room for STEM people who have that mindset. There's a role for them in sports, yes. So they shouldn't just because they got cut from JV, they should not be worried that they.
Honestly, sometimes those people, oftentimes those people end up being the most successful in the industry. Like, so I would certainly encourage. Like, at times, I'll be honest, particularly in the NFL, there is some traditional thinking where people say, hey, look, if you didn't play or you didn't play at a high level, that, okay, it's not going to, but like that mindset is dying. And quite honestly, it's misguided, because at the end of the day, like if you're working in a front office or on a coaching staff, we're not hiring you to block, tackle, or score touchdowns, hiring you for your mind and your people skills.
That is very cool. Something else that is really cool is be the solution, because in addition to COVID, a major issue, well, it's been a major issue for decades, but a major issue that's come on the front page is what's been happening in terms of relationships between police and Black men and Black people. And so can you talk to our audience a little bit about Be the Solution and how it got started and what it does?
So Be the Solutions really spawned last summer, specifically in the wake of the George Floyd incident. And it obviously affected our country pretty deeply, but it also affected our organization from players, coaches, football staff, business staff, and myself personally, because I think, certainly, a lot of our, Black employees could really kind of, the incident really just resonated with a lot of experiences within our lives. But we also had a number of employees that understood the severity of the moment, and we're really more or less we're looking for a way to help, or even just an outlet to get educated on issues. Incredibly blessed and fortunate that we have an organization of people across all different walks that really do have a heart for service and a heart for community, and an ownership group, quite honestly, that is 100% supportive of improving Cleveland community. And so essentially Be the Solution is a campaign where it provides ways for people to get educated, and it provides ways for people to get involved in social justice work. The response has been really incredible internally and externally, because what we didn't want to do is really just lose the emotion of the moment, just say, hey, look, this is wrong. We're outraged. how can we use the moment to do something productive and create some level of impact, at minimum with our local communities. And so that's really how it started, and the ultimate goal.
This all started with an email from you, I understand.
It did. When everything happened last summer, internally we had a lot of people who were struggling with it, and quite honestly, I was struggling with it too. And so the email was really more to get a few things off my chest and just kind of show some empathy to people who were also struggling, really probably who were struggling over that time dealing with it, but then also to, issue a little bit of a challenge to our organizations like, hey, we all know that this is wrong. We all know that this is a problem. Why don't we actually just try and do something? And it wasn't meant, quite honestly, it wasn't meant to be public or, really turn into be the solution or anything along those lines. But the response was great. People, it was basically a challenge where I wanted people to either get educated, pledge to get involved in, a number of different initiatives, or donate to worthy causes, local causes that were doing work. And they used the education materials. They did videos in terms of what they learned. They got involved. We ended up raising a lot of money as well. And really the response was incredible.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that. I think that the lesson that I take away from it is that you really have to be a social justice warrior in your own space. You change the world one person at a time, one community at a time. And I thank you for taking leadership on that, because that's really, really important. So we are going to move on to our next section of our podcast, which we call Rapid Fire. You can guess. They're questions that we would just like, a yes or no answer, but you'll be allowed a few minutes for explanation if you feel the need. And so the first question for you is, will robots ultimately come for your job?
Yes.
Yeah, really?
Yes, but I'm going to say when I'm either very, very old or at the tail end of my career. Hopefully.
Good answer. All right. Number 2, is social media the best or the worst?
Yes and no. But I'm going to say, I am going to say yes. I think social media can do a lot of good in terms of getting positive messaging or call to action. Unfortunately, in sports, we also do see a lot of the the bad, unfortunately. But I think it's a net positive. But all good things have their negatives as well. But I'm going to say it's a yes, a net positive, for sure. Okay.
Now the final and most difficult question. Yes or no, does pineapple belong on pizza?
No, that's a strong no.
See, that's what I'm saying.
It's not even debatable. It's not even debatable. And I will tell you this, my wife and my dad would tell you the exact opposite. They're just so misguided, Michelle.
It's unbelievable.
But
misinformation.
It's honestly, I think it's the grossest thing to have on pizza possible. I just hope, like Hawaiian pizza. Nope, it's awful.
I think we need to do a public information campaign too.
We just need to show people the light.
On proper pizza topping. Is there anything else you'd like us to know before we wrap up?
I guess maybe the thing that I would share, and I would speak specifically to the Destination Imagination teams and people who are involved in that program. I think it's something that people will come to appreciate as they get older. The skills that you are developing by engaging and participating in the program. I think that growing up, it's easy for us to teach our kids what to think as opposed to how to think. And that's why I think Destination Imagination is so important. So I'm excited to be on here. I'm excited to be an advocate for the program. I'm looking forward to what, once the pandemic eases and everyone can be together again. But I would just encourage everyone who's involved in that to really compete in earnest and realize that you're developing life skills along.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And one last question. Sure. What big ideas excite you now?
I think the big idea that excites me now, and this is relative to my industry and my space, but I think it probably spans other industries as well, is we're at a pretty exciting time where the use of data, and I would say specifically NGS or player tracking data, has a real chance to have a major positive impact in terms of how our sport makes decisions or quite honestly views the game. We saw this a lot in baseball and in basketball when their player tracking and motion technology really changed game strategy and how the game, how players were evaluated. And I think we're on the cusp of maybe a similar transition in the NFL, which is something that certainly excites me on a daily basis because it's an area where hopefully teams and us specifically can gain a competitive advantage as teams figure out how to use it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So all best for another successful season. I will be watching you. I'll be watching the G-Men too, but I'll be watching you. And thanks so much for joining us today. We'd like to acknowledge that this episode of What's the Big Idea was recorded on land originally inhabited and cultivated by the Erie, Lenape, and Shawnee nations. We are grateful for this land and for the people who have stewarded it for generations. This episode was produced by Kelsey Selleck with additional material provided by Renee Rainville and Johnny Wells, and with music by Kevin MacLeod. Special thanks to our guest, Andrew Berry, for joining us today. You can learn more about Andrew, his work, and the Be the Solution campaign by visiting clevelandbrowns.com. I'm Michelle Tuck-Ponder. I thank you for joining us. And to learn more about our show and how DI can fuel even more big ideas, visit us at destinationimagination.org. Thanks.
The U.S. Department of Labor estimates that 65% of today's students will be employed in jobs that have yet to be invented. We have no way of knowing what those jobs will entail, but we do know that the skills that will prepare them for success are the skills that they develop through Destination Imagination. Hi, I'm Johnny Wells, Director of Education for Destination Imagination. Before joining the staff, I was a team manager for over 40 teams. Being a team manager is still one of the most rewarding experiences for me as I watched hundreds of students thrive and grow. Destination Imagination, or DI, is an international project-based competition that reinforces the 4 C's: creativity, communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. You probably heard about those skills in today's episode, and DI is the place where kids like yours develop those skills for themselves. Students work together in small teams to create solutions to an open-ended challenge. DI's team challenges fall into one of 7 categories: scientific, technical, engineering, fine arts, improvisation, service learning, or, for the younger children, early learning. A DI team selects one of these 7 challenges and prepares a solution to present at a local tournament. Throughout the experience, students create projects, solve problems, build relationships, learn new concepts, and have a great time in the process. We're building the workforce of the future. Today's DI participants are tomorrow's innovators, problem solvers, and leaders. If that sounds like a good fit for you and the young people in your life, we'd love to have you join us. To get started today, visit destinationimagination.org/learn more.